Both the Old Testament and the New Testament make important modifications to the institution of slavery when you compare them to the cultures of their day. In the biblical understanding, some of the redemptive components in the surrounding cultures and areas um, were very, very different in comparison to the Israeli understanding. Now, I would not be arguing that any of these laws, so to say, are something that are to be understood in the way that we all see them today, as in they were good and that they should be followed now. I will not be arguing anything of that sort, but I will only be saying that they were improvements from what was already existing in that time frame. So, here's some examples of that. First, the number of days off that individuals had. Many ancient Near Eastern cultures gave slaves time off for festival holidays and what have you. But when you look at the extent of holidays within the biblical understanding, such as Deuteronomy 16 and chapter 31, and for the weekly Sabbath rest, which is Exodus 23, verse 12, you can see that the Israel understanding was much different and was better. You can really compare it to those things. Second, you see an elevated status in worship setting. Some ancient Near Eastern cultures restricted slaves from being a part of rituals and any kind of sacred events. The Roman Empire, as an example, would not allow slaves to be a part of the ceremonial aspects of their religious festivals because they were thought to have been a polluting influence to the entire event. On the other hand, the Israelite people and their communities encouraged slaves to be fully participating in the worship of Yahweh and what have you. This is seen and supported in Exodus chapter 12 verse 44, Leviticus chapter 22 verse 11, and Deuteronomy chapter 12 verse 12. Next, the release of Hebrew slaves after 6 years. Most ancient Near Eastern cultures had no legal requirement for the release of slaves. Since the duration of ownership was completely in the hands of the master, many slaves served for life, or at least until they could be purchased, and they would get free in that kind of way. But this was normally an impossibility. But when you look at the Bible, for example, such as passages like Leviticus 25, verse 39 through 43, and Jeremiah 34, verses 8 through 22, and compare them, let's say, to like the laws of Hammurabi. It's a bit different from each other, and you can see that you could definitely argue for a very well put improvement from that. But this kind of prescribed release of debt slaves after a certain number of years was a unique and highly redemptive legislation, which wasn't really offered by other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Next, we have provisions given to the slaves upon their release. When you see that the material assistance for released slaves stand out as a generous act of biblical law, seen in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 through 18, other law codes don't really seem to have that. They don't have this kind of descriptions and their understandings. So that's another thing that really does help. And again, these things aren't perfect, but they're just slight improvements of the day. Next, we have the limitations on physical abuse. And we then see freedom of damaged slaves, slaves that were beat. The biblical slavery limited the severity of beatings the masters could inflict upon their slaves. See Exodus 21, verse 20 and 21. Also, any slaves who were physically beat or really badly hurt by the slave master would get their freedom, and they were able to just go free from their the abuse of that master. Most other cultures were constrained in the physical abuse of slaves through the logic that they were damaging their own property. But this logic only gave way to torturous treatment of select slaves as an object lesson for other slaves. Most foreign laws were extremely relaxed in restraining the abusive hand of the master, and the physical and sexual abuse of slaves was generally seen as the owner's prerogative. In the Roman context, there was even legislation that prescribed the torture of slaves in certain legal cases. So, a slight improvement of that. Again, these aren't good circumstances. It's not a good thing that you. It still isn't good that they were able to say, well, you can beat them, just don't beat them too bad. It's still not good at all. It's still awful, but it was an improvement. It was a thing where you could say, you know, just don't do it this. It's just minor improvements over time that these people would do. We also see the condemnation of of stealing people or slaves and what have you. Now, this is a fun line for the apologists that they like to use. We see a lot. Exodus 21 verse 16. But this was a big thing of that day. It was something that isn't really found as much in other areas. There was at least a great improvement of that time frame. Not only do we see this, but we also see the refuge and safety for the runaway slaves. For instance, the Code of Hammurabi prescribed the death penalty for abetting a runaway slave. So the Israelite understanding was an improvement. It was better because they would get to go to these refuges and be safe for a particular time. Now, not only was there improvements from for slaves from the biblical understanding, not perfect, but just slight improvements to where later people would eventually, rid these things from the abolitionist movements for Christians doing that. But we also see some good things from women's. We see the improved rights for female slaves and concubines. You look at the ancient Near Eastern world. These young women and concubines were redeemed. Were good. They held virtually no rights on their own. While the Old Testament permitted the sale of daughters as chattel slaves and concubines, it made significant redemptive moves against the blatantly unchecked expression of patriarchy, which is seen in Exodus 21, verses 7 to 11. Unlike foreign law codes, the biblical text limited the sale of concubines to within the Israelite nation and granted to these women, quote, rights that were normally afforded to daughters who were married in the customary manner, end quote. Also, we see you were unable to beat a wife. There was no kind of bodily punishment on a wife. Ancient Near Eastern laws and ancient women were extremely vulnerable to physical punishment by their husbands. Sometimes the husband's punishment was mediated through the community, but often it was just within the household. Babylonian codes has women being drowned to death in opposition to their husbands. Assyrian law granted husbands that were stronger, or I should say, more stronger and more direct rights over their wives. And this is just something that is kind of foreign to the Israelite understanding. So these are things that were very well, when looking at the foreign comparison, the later canonical emphasis on sacrificial servant-type love for one's wife, and there emerges within scriptures a striking sense of elevated respect for the female marriage partner. So these were all things that were improvements. We even see women's gain of inheritance rights. The daughters of Zelophehad courageously asked to get land from the family in the view of their father dying without any male sons or whatnot, to whom he could get the inheritance to them. It was the daughters that would get it. This is seen in Numbers chapter 27. So these are all just small things that I thought I would go over to describe how the Hebrew Bible improved on just limited things, not perfected, but just improved to get us to where we are today. So thank you all for watching, and like and subscribe for more content like this.